L'Hermione. She's a French ship, so it's L'Hermione. And if you need problems saying that, think of it as L. L is just the. Air, A-I-R. Me. Own, O-W-N. L'Hermione. L'Hermione. 76. The French Connection. The year was 1765. Colonists had been in North America for more than a century and a half. It had not been an easy transition from their lives in England and on the continent. More than half who came in the early ships of the 17th century were gentlemen and their wives. They brought with them their finest clothes, powdered wigs, leather footwear, and their symbolic walking canes with silver heads. Adventurers, risk-takers? Oddly, yes, but born and raised in a vast kingdom of privilege. The simplest tradesman had his store, had his forge, maybe a hostler, his stables, or his inn. The elite, their estates and their staff. Here, in a new world, nothing. Imagine yourself getting on a train, a bus, an airplane, being whisked off into the middle of a wild and unpopulated forest with some other folks, friends perhaps, maybe some colleagues, relatives. Hopefully you brought some tools, maybe some nails, tools of your trade, spikes, that sort of thing. Or did you think you could run to the local ironmonger and have some of these worked up? After all, they have plenty of money. What good's it can do them here? Well, you get my drift. These were decidedly not primitive people, but they of necessity had now to resort to a very primitive lifestyle. If you wish to live in a dwelling, you got to build it from the ground up. None for sale here. Grow your own food. Protect yourself and your family from whatever new dangers you would surely encounter. And you've heard the stories. They were hard, hard times. Severe drought laid the groundwork for famine, for starvation. Clear and irrefutable stories of cannibalism. Remember, this was us, the English gentry tradesmen, professionals, aristocrats, living on roots, berries, and human flesh. There were many expeditions to explore and settle North America. Not all were successful. But finally a foothold was established and colonies grew into villages. Villages grew into cities. Commerce began to follow a regular schedule and discipline. Industries sprang up and grew. Supply and demand began to work its magic. And the crown was paying attention. Again, imagine yourself in this situation. You've arrived, grown a society with largely like-minded people, established a culture, industry, a trade, whatever. But the British king still considers you a subject from Latin, placed beneath. Open to inspection, examination, and direction. It's not a bad thing to live under a set of rules, guidelines that you've had a role in creating and enacting and have brought forth a system of enforcing. Those rules determine how you'll proceed in order to grow, in order to live, in order to thrive and succeed. But given what you've sacrificed and worked hard to create, putting your very life and welfare on the line, if a parliamentary government thousands of miles away who took little or no part in your success, all of a sudden in 1651 says, we've decided that you must now cede to me a large part of all you produce, the Navigation Acts. How do you feel? Not happy. Oliver Cromwell thought it was a swell idea. Then again in 1660, 1663, more of the Navigation Acts. More usurious taxes. And now King George enters the picture with the Plantation Duty Act, 1764, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, the famous Tea Act, and a few years later, the Stamp Act. Many in America saw no problem with many of these laws because they were external largely, and they regulated and enhanced commerce. So they continued to operate under these restrictions for well over a century. The Stamp Act, on the other hand, was to the colonist simply an instrument to raise revenue for the crown, nothing more, and therefore unlawful. Taxation without... Did anybody say representation? Now, that's why I ask you if you've been to my lectures before. The rewards are many, numerous. and they are dark chocolate. Now, against the law, therefore against the king. Taxation without representation. While options for representation were offered by Parliament, the colonists rejected the idea because of their local circumstances. Distance, no means to travel, no understanding of representation. They didn't participate. The seeds of revolution are planted in the soil of an American populace who want nothing more than the enjoyment of what they've built and the gain therefrom. Those seeds are nurtured and fertilized with the sweat and zeal of an enraged and loyal brotherhood of men who see their patriotism, their engagement, as an integral part of this environment, as matured of their own hand, with no real participation from King George III. Yet now in 1765 he demands even more tribute. Well, now we've set the stage for a unified act of deliberation, which would disabuse King George of his proprietary inclinations toward the colonies that have essentially become ours. That pure and earned nationalism prompted us to act for redress of the many demands and restrictions placed upon us, a level-headed request to cease and desist, which we felt sure would not be honored, but we'd had enough. George did not back down, of course, and the cry to arms was heard throughout the land. With the altercation at Concord, all options were obliterated. The war for independence, the American Revolution, had begun. The year was 1775. Britain entered this war with a very high level of confidence and a reasonable level of preparation. How could we hope, under even the best of circumstances, to prevail against the most powerful political force in the world, against a naval force acknowledged to be unbeatable? About 170,000 British sailors served throughout the war. And the King's Navy had over 150 warships with 70 guns or more, and many of those had 100 guns and more. The King commanded a well-trained and well-equipped army. I'm not at all sure we were confident in his victory as we bragged to be. We had no army. Yet each of the 13 colonies had a militia or provisions for a militia. No uniforms, no issue of military-grade firearms. Here's a good look at our entire naval force in 1775. That's it. 0 ships. There was no formal government, no financial system, no banks, no munitions manufacturers, no functioning departments of government. These were significant disadvantages. But these revolutionaries were not dummies. They knew England's strength, but they also knew that England was not united completely against the colonies. The Tories were, for sure. But the Whigs, that was a different story. The Tories were referred to as loyalists by the colonies. Loyal, that is, to King George. And the Whigs, very pro-America up to the question of independence, were called patriots. Divisive teams, to be sure. Even among the colonists, only about 45% supported this, what was to be a revolution. 20% remained loyal to the crown. They were, after all, British citizens, and that's the way they saw themselves. More than 1 in 3 colonists laid low, remained neutral, had little care who came on top, as long as they and their families were not harmed or inconvenienced. The Founding Fathers also understood that they were acting for a large percentage of the land mass of America and the percentage of the populace, but not all. 13 colonies. Britain ruled 32 colonies in 1775. Not looking too good for us at this point, was it? But wait. We had a secret weapon. Who was that? Who? Who said Franklin? We'll catch me next time. Of course we're going to talk about Lafayette, but Ben Franklin, good old Dr. Ben. Ben Franklin was our ambassador, as it was, to France from 1776 to 1783. He was an intellectual. He was an inventor, a writer, a philosopher, and the bon vivant. He met and endeared himself to France's upper crust, the aristocratic and diplomatic community, and of some importance, their cadre of financiers. His passion and his aspirations breathed fresh air into France's reach for a new and more unified spirit, a new order, if you will. So he became a hero of sorts with a great deal of influence on both sides of the water. Now, adding to that fortunate relationship, France had recently been humiliated. Remember the 7 Years' War that they won over France? Although our good Dr. Ben didn't see it in these terms, France was ripe for the picking. They wanted to settle up. Revenge is sweet. And to make a long story short, France entered the fray in 1778. The government recognized the sovereignty of the United States of America and officially aligned with us, declaring war with Britain. They took this anger a step further by building similar coalitions with their strong allies, Spain and the Netherlands. Sort of hung Britain out to dry. England had no significant support at this time. The world was now at war with the Crown, and America was at its spearhead. Now, this was not a shock and awe entry into conflict. In fact, the coalition began with covert operations. The sale to the Patriots of gunpowder and ammunition, largely practiced access and use of French harbors and coastline for alliance ships blockading the British, even extending leave of service to French military strategists and their leaders so they could aid American officers in their strategic war planning. Eventually, as expected, the gloves came off, and France was fully engaged initially as a naval force, providing nearly 150 warships to the struggling American Revolution. This came to light most obviously when Rochambeau led some 6,000 men and landed at Newport, Rhode Island on July 11th of 1780. At this point, America's military manpower was beginning to come up to the dimensions worthy of its land mass. So with Comte de Grasse, Rochambeau, de Suffren, and the alliance of France, Spain, the Netherlands, Austria by default, now how do you like our chances? One small piece of the puzzle is missing: a rock star. Anybody know this guy's full name? Yes, I know you do, dear. Put your hand down. Now, this is 2 chocolates, if you can do the whole thing. Okay, 1 chocolate. Who is he? Oh, no, I don't have that much chocolate. Okay. You can all come get your chocolate. You're all right. Here's the guy's name. Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Montier de Lafayette, the Marquis Lafayette. But he's 4,000 miles away. Oh, what shall we do? Remember that great and powerful American Revolutionary Navy? Yeah, that one. During the war, over 2,200 letters of marque were issued. Do you know what a letter of marque is? I'm saving a lot of chocolate here. Letter of marque was issued to a commerce ship, a trade ship, to enable that ship to go to war any way it chose, boarding, completely destroying a ship, taking its men off, if that other ship were a member of an avowed enemy of the country. So we issued 2,200 letters of marque. It produced 1,700 fighting merchant ships, as it were. Those 1,700 fighting merchant ships, over 2,000 British ships were boarded and captured or sunk over the course of the war. So while we hadn't a lot of warships, we knew how to be a wartime navy. Many of the fighting ships during that period were of French origin. One such was a little frigate. What's a frigate? I'm saving a lot of chocolate here. Well, it's a small warship, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes and be more specific. A small warship at the time, still a pretty good sized ship. It has 3 masts, but not big enough to be called a ship of the line. Anyway, one such was a little frigate named L Hermione. She was built in Rochefort, France, in the Rochefort shipyard on the Charente River in 1779 by a fellow named Henri Chevillard. Take notes, there will be a test. Her building took about 11 months. 11 months. Lafayette traveled by coach to Rochefort and had his first look at the beautiful ship that would carry him into history. He was understandably elated at the opportunity to serve in this capacity. He was a very young man to be appointed general in the American Revolutionary Army. At this point, he was 22 years old. He also must have had a sense of the inherent danger in crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a ship only about 145 feet long if you measure the bowsprit and everything else on. Imagine only half of a football field, a ship that big. Most of the larger ships of the line at the time were 200 and 250 feet long, significantly larger. And looking at the daunting prospect of training a rather ramshackle militia into a disciplined fighting force. His father, however, had been killed fighting the British in the recent 7 Years' War. So he had an axe to grind. Well, his spirit of adventure and passion for the American cause won out, and he boarded on March 11th, 1780, 9:45 in the morning, as I recall, to sail for where?
Philadelphia.
No.
New York.
No. Saving a lot of chocolate. Did anyone say Boston? That's where he went. Boston. General Lafayette was no stranger to America at this time. In fact, he had asked his king for permission to come to visit, but the king refused to allow it, given that at the time he asked, France had no agreement as to any alliance with the Patriots, and they thought it would be a false move. Well, the young man, then all of 19, bought a ship with his own funds, the death of his parents leaving him exceedingly wealthy, and sailed anyway. He came to North Carolina, where he was given a major general's commission by the Continental Congress, and at that point, he was only 19 years old. His duties consisting of aiding General George Washington. After a relatively short service, and upon learning that his infant daughter had died in France, he returned. He immediately began a campaign to drum up greater French support for the American cause, again fueled by Dr. Franklin's enthusiasm. Landing in France in 1779, Lafayette was arrested for having disobeyed the king, but all was soon forgiven as France, after the Second Battle of Saratoga, where General Burgoyne surrendered his British troops to General Horatio Gates, decided to align with the American revolutionaries. Lafayette was returned to America in 1780 in command of French forces that were sent to help. In 1781, he was given command of the defense of Virginia. Now remember, he's a major general, not an admiral. So he and his troops are on foot and on horseback. With the aid of a naval blockade of the York and the James rivers, he drew English commander in Yorktown. The English commander was?
Cornwallis.
Who said Cornwallis? Anybody else say Cornwallis? Since I'm saving chocolate, I'll give that two at a time now. I invented chocolate. Some people don't know that. So here we are, blockading Cornwallis. With the aid of the naval blockade in the rivers. And you're going to hear a lot more about this, or maybe you already have. I'm not sure what the order is. Cornwallis was blockaded by the American forces and by French naval troops under Admiral de Grasse. Where is our little Hermione? We have a roster of the ships of both fleets and a diagram, of course, of their positions. But these are only the ships of the line. In fact, ships of the third rate, second rate, and first rate. That's 65 to 80 guns, about 80 to 90 guns, and the first rate, 100 guns or more. The frigates are generally not mentioned, so you don't see them in the line of battle, but they're there. While we may have come to love the frigate, she would have been a messenger, an outrider, so to speak, in the blockade, perhaps repeating the signal flags of battle positions and orders from de Grasse. Pretty important in a battle where smoke and debris and bodies can create a scene of havoc. Clear transmission of battle orders was critical to the success of the blockade. And the blockade, combined with the naval battle, as you heard last week, and Lafayette's military leadership, which you'll hear about next week, was indeed successful. Cornwallis' surrender was the high point of Lafayette's military career and effectively ended the revolution. Now, King George wouldn't let go so easily and decided to continue to prosecute the war, sort of as punishment for the offense of the colonies to His Majesty. So the Treaty of Paris wasn't actually signed until September of 1783. France, yes, had her revenge, but gained almost nothing in the war and was left, as was England, with a monstrous debt as a result, about 1,000 million livres. Today's equivalent, about $13 billion. Speaking of revenge, here's a nice shot of a French frigate named La Vengeance. La Vengeance, the Vengeance. Guess what the other ship's name is? These are hard questions. It's the Constellation. The Constellation. USS Constellation. And a French ship is going up against her. That's right. This date was February 1st, 1800. Our summer love faded fast when France started demanding reparations and prompt repayment of the millions loaned to America through the course of the Revolution. We were not able to come up with the cash out of our pockets. So France turned on our commerce shipping as payback. Fortunately, we had the beginnings of a real navy by now. And fortunately, this quasi-war, as it was called, did not last very long. Incidentally, Constellation won this engagement. When Lafayette returned to the French army in 1782, he was considered a hero. He became a leader in the movement against the French monarchy. In 1789, he took a seat in the États Généraux, which is the French Estates General, the legislature of France. The adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which he forwarded in France, was his idea, in fact, and was co-written by his good friend in America, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. He was given the command of the Parisian National Guard, a force of citizen soldiers, as it is today, created to defend the new constitutional monarchy. Now, General Marquis de Lafayette's story does not improve from this point in history, and you'll hear more about him later on, but I don't want to get into that. His name endures, and probably improperly, always will. But the little frigate that provided him passage to America and provided the American forces of the Revolution with a spirited, passionate, and effective leader has pretty much been a footnote until recently. So now I give you L Hermione, the little frigate that could. We all know that L Hermione was a Concorde-class frigate. Now, what's a frigate? For chocolate. It is a small fighting ship, typically 28 or more guns and one deck. A first-rate ship has 3 gun decks. Guns on all 3 decks, so does a second-rate ship. And those 2 classes of warship have between 90 and 100 guns. A frigate has 28 or more guns, usually 28 to 36 guns. 6th rate, they could be called, just shy of 6th rate. L Hermione had 32 guns, the largest of which was a 12-pounder. A 12-pounder was a gun that threw a ball that weighed 12 pounds. We all know that she was built in about 11 months. How long did it take to build a typical warship in the late 18th century?
9 months.
9 months, that was a good answer. It's not the right answer, but it's...
Didn't you say 12? 17 years to build the new one.
Sometimes it took a long, long time. Typically, it took from 4 to 10 years to building fighting ships. Now, that wasn't all work. The problem in England was there was a lot of corruption in their shipyards. There were only 6 royal shipyards. And there was a lot of corruption and embezzlement, graft, and everything else. However, they were the shipbuilders to the world. And leaders of other countries came to England to see how they built their ships. They were just slow because of graft. Now, for a bonus chocolate, how much oak went into a typical ship of the line? This is going to knock your socks off. 4,000 to 6,000 loads of oak. Now, a load is the amount of oak timber that can be taken out of one standard oak. In those days of wooden ships, oak was highly valued. But there was also the elm, the fir, the hemlock, and the other woods that were used. That's just 6,000 loads of oak. A standard was 80 to 100 years old. Once she was felled, How long would it take to get another standard oak on that site? 80 to 100 years. You can apply all the new math you want. Mother Nature says 80 to 100 years. Now this is interesting because we're talking about 4,000 to 6,000. Let's use the 6,000. 50 oaks to a controlled acre. 2 acres for 100. 20 acres for 1,000. I'll let you catch up with the math because 6,000 oaks would occupy 120 acres of oak forest. 120 acres. England. How big's England? How many 120 acre plots could she have? England is about the size of Missouri. Add to that, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Iron needed charcoal to refine it into usable metal. Tons of oak were converted to charcoal. And these royal shipyards were building capital ships at a breakneck pace. So was the timber trade a good choice in those days? The answer is yes, and don't get chocolate for that. Of course it was. Many of the lumber growers, timber growers, grew timbers for ships. They trained these oaks from infancy. They were planting materials that would be used after they were long gone. Their children would inherit compass timbers, formed oaks, and that sort of thing. Now, in a few days, you will see the beautiful Hermione. I want to give you an advantage over the hundreds of others who will board that ship every day. First, a brief biography. How was she created? Well, the original, as we noted, had her keel laid in 1778, and she was launched for sea trials in May of 1779. She served admirably throughout the American Revolution, often fighting in company with L'Estrée, a French similar 32-gun frigate under Captain Lapérouse. She returned to France at the close of the Revolution in 1782, formed part of a squadron sent to India to fight the British there, but as peace was declared, she was returned to Rochefort in 1784. In September 1793, again in service against the British, she ran aground off Le Croisic on the northern coast of France. It was wrecked by heavy seas. In 1997, a reconstruction project began in the same shipyard that built the original. It was intended that authentic methods contemporary with the 18th century, authentic period tools and materials would be used. Reconstructing an 18th century fighting ship using 18th century techniques would prove a daunting challenge. And many questioned the sanity of those who gave birth to the idea. But do you know what the Lafayette family motto was? Exactly. Why not? Could also be interpreted as anything is possible, but that was it. Of course, this was not the reason for such a project. The mission of L Hermione is to produce a legacy, to trace a forgotten maritime heritage. It would benefit Rochefort, as the shipyard was shut down early in the 20th century. And the town, largely dependent on this industry, was becoming sort of a ghost town. She would also be a permanent ambassador of the Franco-American relationship cemented at the start of the Revolution. France, unlike other nations, had neither preserved nor reconstructed any of her famous ships built prior to the 19th century. So the building program began with a promise. 3 watchwords were at the top of the project. Authenticity. This reconstruction will be carried out based on archival documents. A historical committee will be responsible for exact adherence to the plans at hand. Seaworthiness. It was intended that the ship would be able to navigate deep seas and be accurately piloted. Sustainability. No shortcuts. The ship would be built to last and maintained as necessary. Well, this would require a few things. First, some money. Lots of money. Lots and lots of money. Ended up being close to $27 million. Second, some materials. The oak, 1,000 pulleys, 32 cannons and cannonballs, shipbuilding stuff that you need. Third, bunch of period tools. Got to scratch those up somewhere. Fourth, about 100 period shipwrights. Now this was hard to do. These 18th century shipwrights had mostly retired. They didn't want to work on ships anymore. Oh, and fifth, a shipyard. Yes, we needed a shipyard. Well, as luck would have it, the Rochefort shipyard was empty. Remember, she'd shut down in 1927. The people of Rochefort were willing to supply about 35% of the money required. So here we go. As shipyards have done since the early 17th century, a model was made. First the model, not after the ship, before the ship. That model provided the lines and curves and structural guidelines that will be brought up to full scale to build the actual ship. The model was built from plans found of the original Concorde, the sister ship to L Hermione. The British had acquired the Concorde and examined it and drew plans up after the Concorde build, and they copied the Concorde from many of their own frigates. Now the keel blocks are laid in the dry dock. The keel is the backbone of the ship, and it must be carefully aligned in its position on these keel blocks. It's made up of several pieces of elm. They're fashioned together with a very unique joint. Elm typically, because it withstands rot much better than any other wood. Next, the stem is raised at the forward end. The stem is at the bow of the ship, and then the stern assembly. And then between those, and the stern assembly is the stern post, which is the powerfully large timber that you see here. I usually hit myself in the eye with this because I can't remember which end has the light in it. That's the stern post. It's one solid piece of oak. And the finest oak was used because that's where the rudder is. It takes the most strain, more strain than any other timber on the ship. Now, the frames are next, and it's interesting that they start midships with the frame, start in the middle of the ship with the first frame. If the frames are out of alignment, the ship will not sail well and generally will not last as long as it should. So a keen eye of the shipwright is required here. Once the frames, which were generally made up of 2 to 4 futtocks. Now, futtock is an odd word, I know, but it's a contraction of the word foothook. That makes a lot of sense too. But these are the futtock pieces, red, green, blue. The futtocks form the frame. There's not one piece of timber large enough and strong enough to be a frame member. So they were always formed of futtocks. Typically 3, sometimes 4, very seldom more than 4. Then we get to knees. These are where compass timbers and grown knees come into play. And this is where real profit comes in the timber industry. This is the crook of a tree. This is a knee. The crook of the tree is used so that the grain follows the stress. If we put 2 pieces together, we'd have a break. If we used a straight piece of timber, we'd have the grain running this way, and we'd have a weakness right here. So this is a grown knee. A compass timber would be a gently curved trunk or limb that was encouraged that way in infancy and grew to be very strong with the grain running with the curve. That's where the expensive pieces of timber were, and that's where the timber folks made their money. Deck clamps were installed, but incidentally, this is a carved out knee. It's bigger than it looked, isn't it? And this is how it's fitted in. You can see the knees and the transverse beams there. The deck clamps are installed, and finally, of course, the planking is added. The planking is the skin of the ship and provides additional strength and integrity to the vessel. With closely spaced frames, interior planking, which is called sealing, and exterior planking, the thickness of oak in a fighting ship's hull may approach 3 feet. Typically, it's about 2 to 2.5 feet of solid oak. Well, now we begin to recognize this huge pile of timbers as a ship. The building of L Hermione would continue for 15 years. How long did it take to build the original? 11 months. 15 years to build it. Before finally leaving the dry dock and launching out into the Charente River. She's not done at this stage, but now as the fitting of the furniture is completed and her 3 masts are installed, her hull is soaking in water, swelling her timbers already adequately caulked to ensure a truly watertight hull, a relatively watertight hull. The final fitting out would entail the addition of what's known as furniture. That is, all the items necessary to the operation of the ship, and generally thought of as everything that's stuck on above the main deck. Miles of rigging, about 15 miles of rigging to support and control the sails. The process of fitting the mast into the holes in the deck is called stepping, and often in the past a coin was set in place under the foot of the mainmast. Here's what the folks at Mystic, Connecticut did with the Charles Morgan when the restoration was complete just a couple of years ago. This is an 1841 silver dollar. It commemorates the original launching of the Charles Morgan and was placed under the mainmast tenon. A 2013 silver dollar for the year it was completed was placed under the mizzen, which is the mast farthest astern. Now, I don't know whether a coin was placed so in the stepping of La Hermione's masts or not, but it would be a neat question to ask the interpreters, wouldn't it? You see, these folks from France know we have a maritime heritage, but I know one thing from experience. They like to show off. So I want you to show them that colonists are pretty sharp also. The bilge pump. The bilge pump is a very important piece of furniture or equipment. Why? You may remember I said relatively watertight hull. All wooden boats leak. Let's say it together. All wooden boats leak. Something to remember if you ever decide to buy a wooden boat. It's just a matter of degree. So what do we do about that? Shoot the caulker, of course. Why not? No. There's nothing we can do about it unless you want to make your boat look non-wooden. Fiberglass, resin, plastic, duct tape, whatever you want to put on it. It's going to leak. You just have to have a good bilge pump. This is one of the 32 guns on board La Hermione. Now, some of the authenticity had to be sacrificed along the way. This is one instance. They sure look real, but to save weight, and the gun this size will weigh about 1 1/4 tons, and she had 26 of them, plus the smaller 6-pounders. And for safety reasons, if the caulker's still around, you do want to shoot them, these won't fire. They're lightweight metal, and you can't fire a projectile from them. There's something else. Now, don't embarrass the crew by mentioning this. What's that? It's a 400 horsepower engine with a propeller on it. Don't tell them, you'll embarrass them. And the sails are not of canvas, they're synthetic. There's also an electric generator for convenience. Okay, you got to eat. And I'm not with the sailors who ate 2-year-old salt pork. They'll cook a decent meal and maybe have some light to read by, I don't know. At dinner time on the Navy ships, they used to play a song or drum a song called Roast Beef of Old England. It was really old roast beef of England. That's what they ate. And that sort of brings us to the last operation prior to getting underway, provisions. Does anybody know anything about this? This is worth a chocolate. Who knows something about it?
They're going to auction it, I think.
Ah, who said that?
That's what I heard too.
Okay. You get a chocolate and you get a chocolate. Who heard? You said you heard, and you were first. There, go. I hit a lady in the head one time with the chocolate. So I didn't like that. Hennessy was one of the big financial supporters of this project, and they loaded 2 casks of very fine cognac onto the ship. I think it's going to be auctioned at Mount Vernon. I'm not positive, but it's going to be auctioned to raise money for the project. So there you go. You got a couple of kegs of brandy, cognac. You really don't need much of anything else. So provisions are done. I don't know what your grocery bill looks like, but think about the shopping cart that you'd have to roll out to feed 70 to 150 people for a month. Of course, there's plenty of room for provisions. Not all of those casks are brandy or cognac. There's food in there also, I hope. There's a lot of food in any event. Well, and a lot of guys, and a lot of space. This was interesting. It was sent, well, I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. There aren't any people in here. They're all ducks and geese and with funny costumes on. I wanted to show a cutaway view of the ship, and I'll show you a better one later on. So I was conversing with these folks in Rochefort, and this is what they sent me. I don't know whether they pulled my leg or not. Here we are today in any event. The frigate, as you can see, is leaving Rochefort. This is from the Rochefort view, and she's on her way here. This is from our view to Yorktown, Virginia. Here's her proposed itinerary. Of course, we're only interested in that one. When she ties up here, you'll undoubtedly have an opportunity to go aboard, and Norma has provided a list of the activities that come along with La Hermione. There's a lot going on. It's not just a visit by a ship. There's a lot going on. They have a village that they set up at the moor side, etc. If you're Navy and you have an opportunity to go aboard and you're in uniform, you know what to do first. You salute the ensign aft, then you salute the quarterdeck. If you're not, you wonder, what's a quarterdeck? Where's aft? So, here's your Cliff's Note summary of a new language for you. It's not French, and French would have been very helpful in my communications with the folks in Rochefort, but I don't speak French that well. But this is how to talk like a sailor. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, that's the wrong slide. Never mind that. Okay, here we go. A bow is the front or the point of a ship. 4, direction toward the bow. You don't have to memorize this, we made copies for you. Stern is the rear or stern post of a ship, and aft is toward the stern of the ship. Amidships, the middle or center line of a ship. A thwart, across a ship, left to right. Midships, athwartships. Starboard, the right side, looking forward. Port, the left side, looking forward. If you turn around, that side is still the starboard side, but it's no longer on your right. The Vikings had one steering oar. Probably because they were right-handed, always ended up on the right-hand side of their ship. So they called that the steerbjorn, steerboard, starboard side of the ship. The other side was brought into a dock to load, larding, lading, larboard side. Larboard and starboard sounded too much alike, so in the 19th century they changed it to the side you bring into port. So port and starboard became the words. So port and starboard. Now, freeboard. All above that blue line, which is the water line, is dry, and it's freeboard. All below, obviously wet, draft. Mast, the vertical spar which supports a sail. Spar, generally any pole on a vessel. Yard is a spar hung from a mast by its center, onto which a sail is bent or affixed. Bowsprit is a large spar running out from the stem of a vessel. Forecastle, but sailors like to drop bows, and sometimes the most forward deck on a ship is called the forecastle. The poop is the sternmost deck, and the quarterdeck is the command deck of a ship. So here you have a bowsprit, for instance, right here. This is a mast. This is a yard, which is a spar also. Here's the forecastle. Here's the poop. And here's the quarterdeck from which the captain of the ship commands. These are also yards, even though they're not crossed like this. This is called a lateen yard, from Latin. So, foresail is the most forward sail. Mainsail is the middle of the largest sail. Mizzen sail, the sail aft of the main mast, mainsail. A stay is a heavy line holding the mast upright. A shroud, heavy lines holding the mast upright, port and starboard. And a staysail is a usually triangular sail bent to a stay. So if the sail were fixed to these stays, they would be called staysails. Here are the shrouds, come down to the sides. Okay. Foresail, this would be the forecourse, the foretopsail, the main course, the main topsail. This is called the top gallant or t'gallant, and this is called a royal. You're going to be salty when we finish this. And remember, a wall is a bulkhead, not a wall on a ship. A floor is a deck. A stair is a ladder. Downstairs is below. Upstairs is topside. A pulley is called a block. And tackle is usually not pronounced that way. It's pronounced take-all or tackle. Sailor will whistle up the wind when becalmed, or he might even scratch the shroud, same thing. And walking the plank was almost never ordered. A captain of a ship is not necessarily a captain in rank, but is the highest ranking command officer on the ship, even if he or she is a lieutenant. And finally and quickly, facts are not always factual. I have to get my chocolate ready. Who was the patriot who rode through the night and warned the colonists in Concord, Massachusetts of an impending British invasion? Raise your hand. How many people said Paul Revere? How many people agree with Paul Revere? Raise your hands. Okay, now, who has another answer? On April 8, 1776, Boston patriot Paul Revere and William Dawes set out on horseback from Boston to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were targets of the British, and to rouse the Minutemen. As the two made their way, patriots in Charlestown waited for a signal from Boston informing them of the British troop movement. As previously agreed, the Old North Church would display one lantern if they were crossing, marching out of the city on Boston Neck, and two lanterns if they were crossing the Charles River to Cambridge. Two lanterns were hung, and the armed patriots set out for Lexington and Concord accordingly, along with maybe 30 or 40 other people. Along the way, Revere and Dawes roused hundreds of Minutemen who armed themselves and set out to oppose the British. Revere and Dawes arrived in Lexington and warned Adams and Hancock, then set out for Concord. Revere and Dawes. Along the way, they were joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young patriot who'd been riding home after visiting a lady friend. Early on the morning of April 19th, a British patrol captured Revere. Dawes lost his horse, forcing him to walk back to Lexington on foot. However, Dr. Samuel Prescott escaped and rode on to Concord to warn the patriots there. Samuel Prescott. What did Paul Revere, Dawes, and Prescott announce on this midnight ride? What? That's what Shakespeare tells us. The British are coming. The British are coming. They were all British. The British are coming. Oh, no, they visited yesterday. They'll be here again tomorrow. Of course they will. Probably what was said, first there was no shouting because this is the mission of secrecy. The regulars are coming out, was what they almost whispered as they roused the patriots. When was the Boston Tea Party? I don't remember this date. Most people don't, but the correct answer is actually a question. The question is, which one? There were two. One on December 16th, 1773. Hundreds of cases of tea were shut down the Boston Harbor because of the smell. And in March of 1774, about 16 or 20 cases. So there were two. Which Indian tribe carried out this vandalism and how many were killed? This is an easy one. Which Indian tribe and how many were killed? They were not Indians. That's correct. They were the Sons of Liberty. But how many were killed, unfortunately? Not a single one. Were the soldiers such as we see here at Valley Forge so ragtag, lean and hungry? Not all. France had supplied so much in clothing, boots, etc. that Washington had trouble finding adequate storage space for the surplus. When was the Declaration of Independence signed? And we started out on July 4th, 1776. John Hancock was the president of the Continental Congress at the time they signed. However, you couldn't call everybody or send an email message, so it wasn't until November 4th, 1776 that the last delegate, Matthew Thornton from New Hampshire, signed the Declaration of Independence. So it took a number of months. How many of the 56 signers, 13 colonies, 56 signers, were not even born in the U.S.? Of 56 signers, how many of those were not born in the U.S.? Not a single one was born in the United States or America. Not a single signer. Well, there you have it. A history lesson and an invitation. Go to Yorktown, board L Hermione when she comes in. She'll be here for a few days. Then come to the Mariners Museum, America's National Maritime Museum, and enjoy the stories of ships, shipwrecks, and a good cup of coffee. There we have it.